Hey, ghouls and gals, welcome to an episode of Abyss Gazing, a horror podcast where we celebrate all things spooky and mental health.
I'm your co-host, Mark Moore.
And I am your other co-host, Josh. What's going on, man?
Oh, not much. Just hanging out, doing what we normally do, and gonna discuss Saw.
You want to play a game?
For
I mean, we didn't
sure.
even get 2 minutes in, so uh no. I'm really excited to do this episode because Saw is one of my favorite horror franchises of all time. There's I think by this point, if you've listened to our Mark and I's like conversations, whether it's been on Victims or it's been here, you know that there's a little bit of an age gap in here. So there's a little bit of a appreciation gap for some of these horror franchises as well.
Well, well, I think we really discovered how much of an age gap it was last night. So, like
Yeah,
15
this
years
is
or something like that.
this is true. It is just shy of 10 years actually.
Oh, okay.
Mark and I had dinner last night with his wife, and yeah, the subject of like age, because I guess I never actually asked you like how old you were. You always just refer to yourself as an old fart, and I'm always like, can't be that old.
Yeah. And then it turns out I got a decade on you at least. But no,
Well,
I
so
so
yeah,
I, I've always had an appreciation for Saw too, as well. Um, Simply because when it was being developed, I saw the early development articles, news articles on it, talking about this movie. How are they going to pull it off? The whole thing takes place in like a room with two guys chained up in a gross bathroom. And I followed the development of the movie up until it was released. Um, and it was when I pretty much followed the whole franchise. The only one I haven't seen, I think, is the newest one with Chris
this
Rock. That's the only one I haven't seen yet.
Spiral ended up
And,
actually being one of my favorite movies of last year. So
yeah, yeah, I heard it was good. It's what is it? A spinoff or is it a direct sequel?
So this bad boy is a direct. It's not a necessarily a direct sequel. This I'm holding up the steel book for this that came out last year. It's freaking like the colors on it just really pop. But no, this is a spinoff. I guess that's like the best way to put it. Like because it takes place outside of the outside of like the normal continuity, and I think even in like another city entirely, um from the main continuity that we see in Saw 1 through 8, 1 through 7, and then Jigsaw. So
Yeah, and
Jigsaw 9, 10, whatever it is, they're
I know they're working on a new one. I think for is it
yeah,
this year? Yeah,
I think it's either going to be this year or next year. I don't know honestly. But for me, like this was one of the very few horror franchises that I was experiencing as they were coming out. I was not blessed to be born in the '80s in like the golden age of Freddy and Jason and Michael and Chucky and Pinhead, and throw some Leatherface in there because he had
yeah,
his timeline's weird. But no, like Saw was the first film series that like I actually got to enjoy as they were coming out and got to actually experience it firsthand. And so because of that, this series means a great deal to me. It's my number 3 favorite franchise in the horror behind Halloween and Scream. And I think the reason that I am such a huge fan of this series is because of its serialized storytelling in the first 7 entries. It's one long story.
yeah.
And I've never seen any other horror franchise do that.
Not quite the way they did this one. I think it takes place. The entire series takes place over the course of a few years. but it's a
Yep.
continual story from one end to the other. And it's Saw ended up being one of those franchises that people either loved or hated. I don't know anybody who was like, it was okay. I'll watch it if it's on, but it's either it's awesome or I hate it because it's torture porn. And, and the traps and puzzles are almost as much of a character in the series as Tobin Bell is, as Jigsaw and everything. So it's a fun series, but it's not for everyone simply because of what it is.
Well, let's talk about the influence that this film had, and to your point when you brought up earlier that this is a film that essentially had no anyone famous connected to it, with the exception of the first film, the film we're talking about today, having the Carrie. I can never pronounce Carrie Yules and Danny Glover were kind of like the two big guys attached to this. And I think if I remember correctly, in like from like IMDb trivia, like they only had Danny Glover for like a couple of days. And like the entirety of this film was like shot within like a matter of like maybe a week and a half, 2 weeks tops. Um,
Well,
Correct me if I'm wrong.
it was somewhat low budget to begin with. Um, it wasn't. I think the most expensive part of the movie was Carrie Yules. I've heard his last name pronounced Elways. I don't know how his last name's pronounced, but I think his salary and Danny Glover's salary were the biggest parts of the budget. But you got outside of like the 90s and very early 2000s, I don't think Danny Glover has done a whole lot. So I think he was kind of on the back end of his career. Um, Carrie has kind of come and gone over the years. He'll do a handful of movies and then he'll kind of disappear, and then he'll do a handful of movies. And Saw happened to be one of those movies. Um, wasn't this one of James Wan's films? I
This
believe.
is actually James Wan's like first film that he
Yeah.
ever did. So like this film launched both him and Leigh-Whannel. Leigh-Whannel also, like, I know that like some people, like you said, like there's a lot of divisiveness about this film, and a lot of it is because of its grotesque use of gore and violence. And I guess we could talk about kind of like the torture porn era of horror a little
Yeah.
bit, because I have a lot to say about that. But I also know that one of the most divisive things about this is that like this was also Leigh-Whannel's like not only like on-screen debut as far as an actor, but one of the only like actual acting credits I think he actually has, if I remember correctly. And his acting has kind of always been kind of criticized as well. Because he's not an actor by trade, he's a writer and he's a director. But you know,
Right.
he, given how intimately him and Juan knew this project and this film, you know, going from being a student film, short film, to like an actual like full-fledged financed film that not only launched a studio with Twisted Pictures but also launched their careers. I think it's you can kind of overlook that, but I don't mind Winnell's performance in this. I think that he is kind of just the right blend of like shady and like has that like kind of like general like freak out moments that like a lot of the audience is experiencing with him. He's kind of like the audience's like surrogate eyes throughout the course of this film.
I mean, it's a horror movie. I guess it would fall in the category of almost like a slasher-esque with the way it's done. Maybe.
I
I don't
would
know.
say that this is more of a whodunit that actually ended up spawning off its own subgenre, because
Well,
we talked about. Go ahead.
well, I know before this, Tobin Bell had been in quite a bit of stuff, but
Mhm.
was kind of the role that really made his career that I can think of.
Yeah, this was his.
I couldn't name you a movie that Tobin Bell had been in before this.
This was a Tobin Bell in the 90s and leading up until this point, and you really don't even see him a great deal. I think he has what I would basically clarify as like a glorified cameo in this movie. He's not in this for a whole lot. He is the quote twist at the end of the movie that he's the guy that orchestrates this whole thing and brought us that iconic door slam and just spectacular score that would follow into the next few movies. But yeah, this was kind of his breakout role. He up to this point was like mostly a like a character actor, like a TV guy, a guy that would show up occasionally on TV roles and like bit parts in movies. But this was kind of the first franchise that really gave him life and really introduced him to my generation because like I had never heard this guy's name before, and the only reason that I know him now is because of this franchise. And the only reason that I still end up watching him in movies, he did a great movie a couple years ago with Lynn Shay called The Call, which is now on Shudder. But yeah, he's just done a lot of great horror since Saw, but Saw was like the breakout point for him as an actor.
Yeah, and by now, most people listening to this has most likely seen Saw or know what it is. So if you're listening and for some reason haven't seen it by now, it's two people trapped in like a raggedy, abandoned. I don't know if it's like a slaughterhouse bathroom, locker room, or like a subway locker room, bathroom. But it's gross, it's nasty. They're chained to opposite ends, and there's a dead guy laying in the center of the room. And the whole movie is trying to figure out why they're there to begin with and what they have in common, while introducing Tobin Bell's character and what he
John
does
Kramer.
and why he does it. Do what?
Yeah, and I was gonna say his character is John Kramer.
Yeah.
I really love his character in this movie, but I also think that this is why I make the argument that, you know, I feel like, and I don't know how you feel, like, I feel like you can't just watch Saw and that's it. Like, I feel like you need the other 7 movies to kind of feel the full, like, effect of the storytelling because it's not just a one-off movie. Like Saw this movie in and of itself is a great movie that can stand on its own because it has isolated storytelling. It's introducing and laying the groundwork for John Kramer, his relationship to Carrie Elways, that would later be discussed in later sequels. And so much of this is just kind of giving you like a sneak peek into this world. And I always make the argument that like to really make John Kramer a sympathetic character and a full-fledged character, like you need all of this. And I think uh, Saw 6 is a great example of that, where you have him essentially targeting the guy who denied him health insurance for his cancer that we find out he dies from in part 3. And then on top of that, Saw the final chapter, or Saw 3D, if you want to call it that, he ends up actually targeting, like the source of that one is targeting a guy that claimed to be in a real life jigsaw trap and basically like rose to fame because of it, only to find out that he was like really like a drunk. And like Saul is able to explore so many of these really important themes throughout the course of the film through John's character. And that's why I would say that like if you really want to see Tobin Bell and what Tobin Bell is capable of doing with this character, invest into the sequels.
Yeah, each installment essentially you can watch on its own. It's not like what they're doing with the new Halloweens, where the new Halloween is essentially one big long movie. and we're getting the third part of the movie this year. Each Saw you can watch as a standalone, but it's a continual story that if you watch from one to the other, it's just a big continuation. It's not like Friday the 13th, where each installment is okay. Jason shows up again, and is essentially the same movie with new kills.
I would disagree with you there. I think that Spiral and Jigsaw stand on their own perfectly. But I think that at least for me as a movie viewer, if I'm going to watch Saw, I am sitting down to invest the next couple of weeks to watching the first seven because they are one complete story for me, the same way that you're talking about the David Gordon Green era of Halloween.
Yeah, but you're also a weirdo too, so.
Look, you are too, man. This is a place where we celebrate the weird things.
Okay, so how do you feel about the fan theory about Saw and Tobin Bell's character, or do you know the fan theory?
Are you talking about the Kevin from
He's really just Kevin McAllister from Home Alone.
Kevin, yeah. God, I love that theory so much, and I love to tell people.
It makes the movies better to think that it's Kevin McAllister has just lost it over his lifetime.
Oh man, I absolutely love it. 100%. I think one of the things that makes this film so effective too is its simplicity. Like I feel like as you were talking or a little bit earlier, you talk about how the traps get more elaborate as the films go on. And like this entire film is one big claustrophobic trap where it's two guys chained to a wall and they're trying to figure out why they're there, who put them there, why they were there, and all doing that while also having this intricate play out of like Danny Glover trying to catch the Jigsaw killer, then also having like Carrie Elway's kid and wife involved, and like there's so much intricate things that are happening, but it's the simplicity of this story in the first one that I think makes this such a great foundational. Because I don't know about you, I feel like as the traps got more elaborate later on in the franchise, this ended up actually being like the story kind of felt like it got a little bit more like complicated and like muddled and like clumsy as it went along.
As it went along, it almost the traps almost became the star of the series as opposed to the characters in the story.
Let's talk about the traps. I mean, granted, here you do see like a little bit like there is obviously the trap of Carrie Elways and Leigh-Whannel. There is with the what?
The reverse bear trap.
The reverse bear trap, and then you also have the guy with the scars. His name is escaping me at the moment. That basically gets like put up to like overseeing and like kidnapping Carrie Elway's kid and wife.
Janitor guy.
The janitor guy, yeah. My question for you is though, what is the hardest or trap, or the trap that makes you cringe the most if you had to go through it yourself in any film in this franchise?
In the second one, when they throw the girl into the pit of needles.
I'm right there with you, man. Like, that irks me so much.
And it's like, nope, I'm just gonna sit in the corner and die. I'm nope, not gonna do it.
There's a lot in this. I rewatched this entire series front to back about a year ago, and there's so much in this series that like got underneath my skin watching as far as like traps. Like there's one of the sixth one where the head of like the insurance has like the merry-go-round, and he has to basically decide out of six people who's the sole survivor. And it's just one of like the most like anxiety driven sequences I've ever seen in a horror movie, because like to quote the Joker, people show you who they really are in their last moments.
Well, I mean, and then you've got the one with the two guys that were seeing the one girl, and they either have to kill her or she dies. That one's fun. Or Chester Bennington super glued into the car.
Man, that just like thinking about that like makes my skin crawl and like makes me feel very uncomfortable. But man.
I mean, they're fun and entertaining movies, but like I said earlier, they're not for everyone. We just happen to be the target audience that's weird enough to enjoy it for whatever reason it is.
So let's try and actually like define this, because I don't quite feel like it's a straight up slasher film. As far as like the genre goes, I would say that Saw created its own subgenre, because Saw ended up spawning off copycats like Hostel and the Human Centipede trilogy that never quite captured the brilliance of Saw. Like it's kind of like you're watching like Michael Myers inspire Jason Voorhees, and then Robert Corman's basically like, we're just going to do massacre for everything possible. Slumber Party Massacre, Sorority House Massacre, Kids Birthday Party Massacre. We're going to do it all. Roger Corman, I don't know if you've made that one yet, but you know, if you want to, give me a call.
And then you had another one with sort of a similar take, was the Cube series. The first one was interesting to see. They were a bunch of people wake up in almost like a prison cell kind of thing, and they have to navigate their way through this maze, and every room may or may not have a trap in it. So it's that same style. It may have come out right around the same time or just before.
Cube, the first Cube actually, so there's 3 Cubes. The first Cube came out in 97. The second one is 2002. And then the third one is 2004. So Cube actually predates this trend. But I could definitely see it being see it being a contender.
It's like almost like a sci-fi version, a sci-fi styling of that kind of movie. So there's more than just Saw out there. It's just none of them really held on and took off like Saw did. I don't know if that's because they put out a new Saw like every Halloween for like 6 years, or why it was, if it just had that style that just stuck with fans and people kept going back. But Saw is like the leading contender in the series, where in that style, where Michael Myers and Halloween tends to be from that style movie.
If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is one death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please If you hear nothing else in the show, understand that you listening to this right now, have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below, wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us.
I will say, for me as a viewer, the reason that I kept coming back to these movies and continuously fight to get people to recognize their greatness is also the same reason that I continue to come back and watch the series year after, not I won't say year after year, but at least every 2 to 3 years, is because of how incredible like the twists and turns are of it. Whereas I feel like I just recently watched the Hostel series, the trilogy, for the first time. Had never seen it before a couple weeks ago, and those movies got progressively worse. And Human Centipede, I think, was another idea that had like, it was good to come like to start off with, and then it got progressively worse.
Well, wasn't Hostel, that was Eli Roth, wasn't it? That did that?
Yeah, that's to me is kind of, it's Eli Roth written and directed, and Quentin Tarantino produced. That's what really makes me sad, is that you have two of the greatest filmmakers of the last 30 years coming together on a project for it to be a lackluster show.
The first one was okay, entertaining. And I don't even know if I saw the other ones after that, because I never heard anything good. Eli Roth stuff has just been kind of hit or miss for me in general.
Sure.
And that may have been why I didn't follow the series, is because I wasn't overly impressed with the first one. But it is kind. I don't even know if I would put it in the same category as Saw.
I would, and I would, simply for the fact that like it is not only from that era. I think it is actually considered 2005, I want to say. The reason that I include it in that scenario is because it is essentially like the third act of it is really grotesque. Where, if you guys haven't seen Hostel, basically it's about it's kind of, the premise sets up is very similar to The Hangover, where a group of guys go across backpack across Europe in order to mend, quote, a broken heart of a friend, in order to make him forget his former lady. And so they end up going to this hostel that's supposed to be extremely exclusive, and the women are supposed to be very promiscuous, and they end up basically finding themselves slowly killed one by one. And in the process of being killed, it's like they end up like revealing that essentially like they're skinned alive and just like going through like the worst, just the worst pain and torture imaginable. And that's why, to me, like I think it deserves to be in the list of torture porn, because to me, I definitely think that like, and I'm on a because I pulled up an article called the 14 best torture porn movies of all time. This is from the Cineaholic, and literally the very first thing that they say is Hostel series, which came out 2005, 2007, and 2011.
Yeah, I almost want to put Hostel more in a slasher category, something along the lines of Chainsaw Massacre than Saw, simply because the traps are part of the story and part of Tobin-Bell's. I can't ever remember his name. I've been watching the series for years and can't ever remember his name in the movie.
John Kramer?
Yeah, that guy. It's part of his engineering. He's like an engineer, and it's part of who he is. Where Hostel, it's almost an afterthought. Again, I'm going by the first Hostel because that's the only one I've seen. But it's almost like, okay, we have to have some violence and blood in the movie, so we're gonna have some horny dudes in a hostel in like Sweden or wherever they're at, and they're gonna meet some hot chicks who's gonna get them all kidnapped and killed. And it's not even the same style story. It's more of, we're gonna do something to try to compete with Saw. It's gonna be kind of similar, but I don't know. I never put it in the same category.
So I will say that, like, I binged all three of them in one day, and so my stance is like, I'm going to place them here. I'm going to side with the Cinemaholic. I can also Cinemaholic, sorry. I can definitely understand with where you're coming from as a viewer. The first one feels like a mixture of just capitalizing on the popularity of Saw, but also at the same time, capitalizing on the popularity of Saw, but also at the same time, like, pushing the boundaries a little bit further, because Hostel, the first one, is a very, very horny movie. It is probably one of the horniest films I've ever seen. And the torture aspect of it doesn't come in until really like the second or third act of the film. It is mostly kind of like a slasher-esque format, the way that it's set up, to where like the friends kind of start disappearing one by one, and then you have one central figure that's left to figure out where everything's going.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not too far-fetched to say it's that genre, but it doesn't quite fit for me just because of the way it develops now. And it didn't become the legend that Saw is. Even new horror fans getting into horror will watch Saw because of the status and reputation that it had for being essentially torture porn, and the traps and the elaborate nature of the traps, and newcomers to horror, they know what it. My mom knows what Saw is because it's got such a reputation, and she's in her 70s. My dad hadn't seen them. This was when the third one was out, had been released to like DVD. So it was fairly early in the series. So we decided we were going to watch the first three back to back. And my mom's like, "Oh, y'all go ahead and watch them. I'm just going to sit here and knit, and I'm not going to watch." So we look over about halfway through, I think it was the third one, and my mom is sitting there with her mouth gaping open, sitting perfectly still, eyes about to pop out of her head, staring at the TV, watching all the traps and everything. And we start laughing and look at her. It's like, "Thought you weren't going to watch." She's like, "I wasn't, but I looked up and just couldn't look away." It's like, and that's the reputation that Saw had and built for itself based off this first movie of two guys locked in a gross bathroom with a dead guy in the middle.
I think that's also what makes this film so compelling. Is I mentioned the simplicity of it earlier, but also at the same time is like, you're glued to the screen because you want to find out what it is about these two guys, why they're connected, and then as the mystery unfolds, you can't help but be compelled to it. And not only that, the cinematography and the there was like this weird fad in the early 2000s where they would do like quick cuts for like editing, so like it looks very jarring, but for some reason in Saw, it's one of the very few films of that era that actually work well because of it. And that to me, I think is another compliment that it goes with, that it's the stunning cinematography that you actually feel like you're in this room and you can actually smell and be disgusted by it. Like Saw is one of the very few films. I'll put Texas Chainsaw Massacre in there as well, the original 1974 version, that you watch and you just feel grimy afterwards. Like you're like, dang, I need a shower now.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of movies like that. Chainsaw Massacre definitely is. I might put Cannibal Holocaust in that because you just feel gross for watching it. Especially if you know some of the behind the scenes stuff.
Yeah, we should cover that movie one day.
Yeah, Cannibal Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting movie. It's a movie that at one point got investigated because the special effects were so good for the time that they actually thought they murdered people.
Oh, I am fascinated about the story surrounding the making of that movie, and like all of like the court cases and like the NDAs that came out about that. Like it's a fascinating thing. But it's actually one of the other films on this list that this website lists, along with The Human Centipede, a Serbian film. No shock there.
I haven't seen the Serbian film, but I've heard enough about it that might actually be one. I don't know if I actually want to see or not. If I watched it, it would be to see why, more than watching it to be entertained.
So I will say, for a Serbian film, I will go on record right now and say that I will never watch a Serbian film. I got tricked into watching Jack Ketchum's The Girl Next Door when I was very young. And that movie, along with like Last House on the Left and I Spit on Your Grave, like a lot of those movies are heavy enough, and I've seen them to kind of also say that like a Serbian film seems like it works alongside those films really well. And I never want to see anything like those four films.
The Serbian film is actually, it may still be banned in some countries.
I believe it still is.
How graphic it is. And even for the day they came out, Last House on the Left and I Spit on Your Grave, good Lord. Even when they came out, I can't even think of a film that was that graphic for rape scenes in a movie. Even now, I can't think of one that's quite that graphic. And they're almost, those specific scenes in those movies are, I'm not uncomfortable watching a whole lot of movies, even horror, but that's uncomfortable to watch even for me.
Yeah, I will say that like when it comes to like torture-esque or like splatter films like Saw, I feel like I have a pretty good stomach for them. And I've gone on record, I've said it many times in this episode, that I love this series. I love this first film. I love the spinoffs that they've done. I am just a Sawaholic. I absolutely am an apologist for the series. But this is kind of like the threshold that I have when it comes to the torture, is because a lot of the torture fits into the narrative. Backing myself into a corner now, but like things like a Last House on the Left, like yes, like those things are like the plot is revolving around someone being raped. But I said this on the episode of That's High Praise Vengeance, where we talked about a the injustice surrounding a sexual assault victim. And sexual assault to me, and I'll say it on here too, for those of you guys that didn't listen, I am a offspring of both my parents at different points in their lives had been assaulted. So I grew up constantly hearing about sexual assault education, rape education, like all of that was very normal in my household growing up. And when I first saw those two films in particular, like I was just like utterly disturbed and like couldn't sleep for days.
Well, there's an interesting case right now that actually was just in the news within the last week or so. And it's more of being relevant, talking about Last House on the Left and I Spit on Your Grave and the way things happen. She as pretty much their vengeance slashers almost. There's a famous case going on right now where a former UFC heavyweight, Cain Velasquez, tracked down and went after, and he is currently in jail, but he went after the accused molester of one of his relatives. So it's like you see this stuff in movies, and then you hear something like this. This is an actual real life event where somebody molested one of his relatives and he went after him, like almost like you see in these movies.
I can't say that I necessarily disagree with them simply because, I mean, maybe not to the point of murder, but definitely to the point of when you look at, and I don't know how we got here, but there is a massive injustice that is being done. I mean, when you look at the statistics, it's like, I think it's like the last I checked is like every 9 minutes a child is molested. But then you look at the justice side of that, and we talked about this last year when we covered Salem Horror Fest, where we did Take Back the Night. And you see that movie, for an example, is like that film explored like the very real like forensic side of it and how there has to be like undeniable evidence because it's like $800 to $1,000 every time that you have to reopen that case. And that's why we see something like I think the statistic is it's like every 25 people out of every 1,000 sexual predators actually see the inside of a jail cell. So the idea is that there's not actually enough in place for things like those kinds of victims to see justice, essentially.
And how often do you see in the news somebody who's convicted gets like 90 days, gets a year, and they've done these horrible things to kids, to women, to whoever, even in some cases elderly. It's like, and you see the cases and the sentencing, and it doesn't make sense. And then you have the extreme other end of the spectrum, like the one I just mentioned, or they had a case, I believe, in Texas, where the dad walked in on his daughter being assaulted and killed the guy, and the courts acquitted him. So you've got extreme cases, extreme ends of the spectrum on a case like that.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess like to bring it back to Saw, there is one of the victims that ends up actually, I think it's the fourth film, but the fourth film actually has them like, not decapitate, but like gouge out the eyes or cut off the hands of a sexual predator. The guy that had like basically drugged and raped multiple women, but had never seen any justice from it.
How would you guys like to help us get mental health resources into schools, conventions, and other events? Well, now you can. Simply go to patreon.com/victims and villains for as little as $1 a month. You guys can help us get mental health resources into current and upcoming generations, educate and break down stigma surrounding mental health, suicide, and depression. And you get exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. And you guys can tell us which Nicolas Cage movie you want us to cover, and we'll do it. All it takes to get started is to go to patreon.com/victims and villains, or simply click the link in the episode description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode. Pick your tier and get started today. Yes, it's that simple. So quickly select the tier that you want and help us get hope into the hands of the depressed and the suicidal today.
Yeah, and it unfortunately it's something that happens, and we get to read about it in the news a lot and see it in the news.
Let me ask you a question specifically about the Saw series, and even more specifically about John Kramer, because in this world, John Kramer is essentially Batman, and he's essentially going after criminals like sexual predators and skinheads and stuff like that.
Yes and no. He's also going after addicts that seem like they want to throw away their life, and he's putting them in the position to choose life or death.
That's also a valid point too.
Yeah, so it's not just criminals. He's putting people in life or death situations where they have to choose how important living is, how important the consequences are to survive. And that's what he's doing. And I believe it was a result, was it the second or third movie that they show it was a result of the way he was being treated for cancer and the denial of stuff, but also of, was it his wife that had the free clinic, and then she got killed, and it was kind of a combination of all of it. And he turned his engineering skills into mad genius and became the ultimate Riddler.
Oh man. So it's the sixth one is where he gets denied but I think it's the fourth or fifth movie that shows his first trap, which is Easel, I think was the guy's name. But basically he's like handcuffed to a chair, and the only way that he can actually get out of the chair and break free, because it'll give out if he like goes through, is like within, I think it's like a minute and a half. He basically has to push through a maze of knives and cut himself in order to break the chair and break free. Like, that might be one of the worst traps in this series, in my opinion.
Well, they also had the guy that had a certain amount of time to get out of the cage by crawling through the razor wire. And the police even made the statement that some of the cuts were so deep that they found traces of stomach acid on the floor and razor wire.
That is this one. That's the very first one. Where he gets like, because he's like all cut up and he's like he's doused in like candle wax or something like that.
No, this was in the first movie. It was when they were.
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying it's in this movie. It's in the very first one.
Oh, okay. Because you were. Oh, yeah. They had some weird ones where he had they had a different one where the guy had to find the combination to the safe, which was written somewhere on the wall. He was coated with a flammable like gel and had a candle for light. So he basically had until the candle burned all the way down.
Man, that's just so brutal. Like I that's another thing I will compliment this series on, is I think that they do really well is the writings for not only why the victims are in these traps, but also how the traps are written. Like, I would love to have just like been like an intern for Twisted Pictures to sit in on some of these writing pitches and just being like, all right, how are we gonna outdo the room? Got it. Let's do a pit full of needles. And an addict named Amanda has to go in and dive in and do it.
I think one of the other interesting ones where it was the second one where they have everybody in the house and they've all been poisoned and they have to find the antidotes. And they've got the container where she reaches up in to get the antidote, but the holes are lined with like razor blades. So she goes to pull her hand out and it just cuts into her hands, cuts into her arms.
Oh, yeah. That's another pretty brutal one in here. I am gonna look up some trivia real quick while we are winding down on time. I love the I'm on IMDb right now, and apparently the tagline in Denmark was death is a shortcut.
Okay.
Really love that. So I don't know if you know this or not. This is actually really interesting. But most films, when they are shot, are actually shot in a out of order, and then they are edited together later in post-production. This film, however, all of the bathroom scenes were actually shot in chronological order, and the film was shot from start to finish in 18 days.
Yeah, they some of that has to do with certain stylings, like hairstylings and set designs, the way they're done, as well as how long they might have approval for certain set and shooting areas. So they tape the movie in pieces and then piece it together. But no, I didn't know that about Saw, that it was shot pretty much in order.
Yes, and so this is actually one that I don't honestly think that we would ever feel the same had this movie been taking this route. But originally, Lionsgate intended for this movie to be a straight-to-video release. It was only upon positive screenings of this film and the test audiences that we actually ended up getting it direct, going into theaters and making the rounds of the festival circuit. And because of that, it's because of that initial change that we also got the subsequent sequels.
Yeah, it's you're fine. That was part of what I remember reading about in the early development, is they were talking about it's going to be straight to video. It wasn't going to be a major release. So yeah, that I was aware
of. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but Danny Glover actually completed all of his scenes in only 2 days. Originally, the concept for this movie was going to be the two characters that Leigh-Whannel and Carrie Elway's play was actually going to be trapped in an elevator, which honestly I feel like would have been worse in my book.
Yeah, I don't think you would have ended up with the same movie by any respect in any way whatsoever. I think it would have turned out to be like a non-supernatural version of was it the Devil, I think it was called.
Yeah. I really hope that we wouldn't have done it. So to sell the concept on the film, Leigh-Whannel shot a scene where he appears to be ensnared in the iconic reverse bear trap. There were no visual effects involved, and he actually had to place the teeth on the reverse bear trap in his mouth in order to make it seem real.
Yeah, everybody knows that, though. Everybody knows that the reverse bear trap.
Do you like director's cuts?
Do what?
Do you like director's cuts?
Yeah, I watched quite a few of them.
I really, really want to see this. So Lionsgate, if you come across this, some way, shape, or form, please make this happen. When the film premiered at Sundance, it showed an uncut NC-17 version of the film, and it was later trimmed and mold it to receive the R rating that it now has.
Yeah, I could see that. There's been quite a few movies they've done that with over the years. Trimmed them down to keep them from being NC-17. I think
Makes
Saving Private
me
Ryan.
so sad. That's a war movie though. I feel like that's a little bit differently.
Yeah, they actually cut that one and re-edited certain parts to get an R rating for it.
It's all the really interesting things that I have. So I love this film. Let us know on social media what you guys think about this film. I kind of want to cover the rest of the movies now. I'm not gonna lie. So maybe like once a year, once or twice a year, we just pick a random day and we're just like, it's all time.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to call this covering the first Saw, we did kind of go off on some tangents this time, but wouldn't be the first.
But I mean, that's the thing about this film is that not only is it's simple, but it's influential. And I will say that, kind of digging into some of the history and also looking at the subgenre of torture porn, I think we did a fairly decent job at this movie.
Yeah, we did.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this up. Where can people find you online?
I just have my Instagram, Peyton Miniatures, Titanium Juggernaut Peyton.
Where he also has concert videos now too, apparently.
Yeah, that was a fun show last night. Cataclysm and Dark Tranquility.
So you guys can follow me. I'm on Letterboxd. I'm at Captain Nostalgia. You guys can follow our parent company, Victims and Villains, by going to victimsandvillains.net, where you can find links to our Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, and wherever you guys get your podcasts from, Patreon, more podcasts like this, movie reviews, and most importantly, our mental health resource library. And remember, the longer that you gaze into the abyss, the more the abyss gazes back. We'll be back in 2 weeks talking about something else spooky.